Well, here we are again with our PMBOK 5 deep dive, and today we're going to continue our discussion of project time management knowledge area with Module 20, and we're going to estimate now the activity resources required to accomplish all of the activities that we've put into our network project diagram, and then we're going to actually finally assign time durations to those activities, which would then have resources. So it will finally then become very close to a real project schedule that we know it and love so well. So here we go. Here is our time management overview. This is one of the, this is the largest, by the way, of the knowledge areas as far as the number of activities in it. Here there are 7 here. And we're going to look at the, we've looked at the first 3 already in the prior module. Today we're going to look at point 6 or 6.4 and 6.5, as we said, resources and durations right there. And in the module after this, we'll finally do our develop schedule and then how we control that schedule. So some of the major comments on the ETO diagram here. Estimating the activity resources. We're going to do the type of resource. Now this is not necessarily people. This could be other things too, goods, materials, equipment, supplies, subcontracts, all sorts of things could be in here. Whatever is required to perform each individual activity that we've defined in the network diagram requires a resource to accomplish that. So here is our data flow diagram. Let's have a quick look at that. What have we got? Our major input here is the activity list up here with the attributes which define the activities to a much greater detail as we saw in our prior module. Of course, our guiding light, the schedule management plan, comes in that gives us guidance on how we're going to assign resources. Now here we have over here activity costs come in. We haven't done that yet. Again, in the real world we may be doing these things concurrently, but at this point we don't have costs, but we can assume that they're there. For this purpose, our risk register comes in. Again, resources have a very high propensity of risk because we're talking about people, and we're also talking about equipment and supplies. We're relying on them to be there when we need it now. So risk is always there. We need to keep that always in the forefront of what we're doing in project management. A big factor now, more than ever here, is our resource calendars are coming in, both from our teams, right there in 9.2. When we acquired our team, we brought in their resource calendars so we know when what their availability is to us. And as we define or mentioned also earlier, conduct procurements as you're buying and purchasing items. The resource calendars of the third parties, as much as we can get, we need to know how that and they fit into our schedule too. So we have those 2 sources of resource calendars that come in now, which are very appropriate now because we're talking about resources. And we also have some OPAs and EEFs come in to help support us or in our task here. So what are the main outputs? Well, the main outputs are the activity resource requirements now, and the resource breakdown structure also. Once we assign resources, we'll be able to put them in a hierarchy so we can manage them better. And they go into our next activity, which we'll be doing, which is actually duration, assigning time to this now, and concurrently goes into develop schedule. Primarily, this is when we're updating and managing the schedule, changing resources, whatever it might be, during the life of the project. So we're not quite there yet to actually have this input valuable to develop schedule just yet. We will after our next module. And again, out to human resources, look what happens. We have our activity resource requirements go into human resources, so they are fully aware what's going on, and our project is fully aware also of all these, the actual people we assign, and we manage it in this iterative, progressive, elaborative environment. So inputs, our schedule management plan, how resources are planned and estimated. We have guidance in there that we put in there ourselves with our meetings, our joint consensus of how we're going to manage resources. The activity list that we produced last module, where we took our individual work breakdown items right down to the nth detail that we have in there, and we either brought them in one-to-one and created an activity, or we could maybe group some activities into a larger activity if it made sense. But 100% of our WBS is represented somewhere in our network diagram by an activity. So we have activity lists and attributes, which defines those activities better. For our purposes here, we're going to use this activity list to determine what resources that we're estimating for. And again, our resource calendars, when and how long each resource is going to be potentially available. And the word potentially is in there just because, this is, again, isn't fixed in time. It'll morph, it'll change. We need to keep this fresh, and that's our job to do that. And again, people, equipment, materials, resources, all types of resources. Risk register has clues in there or specific lists of risks that apply to what we're doing and apply to resources. We may target a certain highly skilled resource that we need, and we need them definitely for a certain period of time. That's a risk if for some reason not only may get pulled away by some other very strong, remember, strong power influence. Some stakeholder on another project may negotiate something with senior management, and for some reason they'll try to pull them away from us. That's a risk. Or that resource might get ill, might have a planned vacation, which we would know from the resource calendar, but still it's a risk, you know, about the things that we don't know, like I'm getting sick and things like that. So, risk register. Our activity estimates, activity cost estimates. We haven't done cost yet. That's chapter 7 in the PMBOK, which is cost management. If we had those again, they'd come in, the cost and availability of those resources that we're going to be planning for now. Environmental factors, where is the resource? Is it here? Is it co-located? You know, where are they? What is their availability? That's all environmental stuff over which we have no control of. Resource skills, again, of course, is very key to getting to who we really need to help us on any particular activity. Organizational process assets. We're talking about people now primarily. We're talking about people with this, staffing policies, of course, procedures. Now here's the other side of resources. Materials purchases and equipment rental policies. We may have some policies in our organization that we need to follow. You know, we don't want to be renegades. You know, we want to follow the organizational processes unless we're able to tailor those with approvals, proper approvals to our project. But those are the assets from the organization that we should look for to help us. Okay, this particular slide I just wanted to mention, and I didn't do this before, but now we're getting so deep, you know, into PMBOK, and you should be running around the PMBOK guide now with a lot more intelligence in how it operates and how you can trace things primarily through your data flow diagrams. You know where the inputs and outputs go from your data flow diagrams that are not apparent on the raw knowledge area overview chart. But as we're just talking about our inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs, they all have a definite numbering scheme if you haven't figured it out already. And there's one little trick there that maybe wasn't obvious to you, so let's just take 1 minute to show you that. The convention is this, n.n.n.n basically, and it's the chapter number in the PMBOK, and here we're talking up here, 6.4, estimate activities. So chapter 6 is 6.section 4, 6.4. Now if it's an input, it's a .1. If we're talking about a technique, it's .2. If we're talking about an output, it's .3. And then whichever particular input we're talking about is the last integer. For example, if we're looking at the activity list, it would be 6.4.1.2, see the item. And that's how you figure that out. These big numbers here, 1, 2, 3, for input, tool, techniques, and output, it's not obvious sometimes that that's what we're talking about, so I hope now that that's clear to you. So that's the numbering convention throughout PMBOK. There. What is that? Well, 6.4.1.5. Okay, good. So let's move on. Expert judgment now, tools and techniques helping us to assign resources to our activities. Again, experts are good. I mean, they're available more than you may think in your organization, I would believe, unless you have a very, very small company. Resource planning, help. How do we plan our resources? How do we, some subject matter experts that will help us estimate things. We can do alternative analysis now as we're trying to choose among resources. Do we want to buy and rent something? We're talking about physical resources, you know, non-human. Do we want manual or automated resources? If it's some kind of a tool we need, you know, an actual physical object or something. And skilled or less capable people is really a big one, of course. That's your people. Can you get by with a less expensive, less skilled person, or do you really need a highly honed skill for a particular or some set of activities where, you know, you're just going to have to pay a lot bigger market price for them, or market price, or whatever the rate is in your company. So you have to decide those things if you have options in that regard. You can look at published estimating data for like kinds of resources, especially material kinds of resources. But you can get labor rates, unit costs. That especially applies not just in your company, because you know you don't have any control over what your resources are paid in your company. That's an enterprise environmental factor. You learn what they're getting, what the rate is, because you have to put it into your schedule, but you have no control over that yourself. But externally, if you hire subcontractors, you're going to want to know, well, what is really the going rate for this kind of skill? So you want to get your best value there when you go out and actually purchase or issue an agreement for skilled labor like that. The trade magazines, you know, the materials and equipment have published estimating like how much is the average cost of concrete per yard in your area where the project is, if they're doing a construction project, for example. So you can get good information out there. It's a good sounding board, number one, so that you don't, if you're estimating yourself, have no other resource, maybe that's the best source you have. Bottom-up estimating, just as it sounds. You start at the bottom with the lowest level aggregate, and you add, you know, activities and things to it until you come to a total aggregate cost that makes sense to put in for resources to put in your schedule. So aggregate the lowest level WBS into total quantities and decompose them even if you need it. But you know, you start at the bottom and work up rather than start at the top and do a guess, you know, at a rate that may not be appropriate. So bottom-up estimating. And of course, as a tool, Our project management software helps us to do these things, to plan and organize and manage resource pools. You should have that kind of capability. Even Microsoft Project, I keep citing that, but that's by far the most widely used project management software on the planet, I'm sure. But even if it's not, I mean, it's widely used, and it has capabilities to help manage and level resources and do sorts of things, do this resource optimization. It helps you do that. Others do it too, and some other tools may do it much better. But here, unless you have a tool in your organization, you're going to have to go find one to help you, because you certainly don't want to do project management by hand. Well, many people do attempt to do project management just by a spreadsheet. I mean, if they're successful, more power to them, but having a good, capable tool will give you great benefits beyond a spreadsheet. So the outputs of our estimate activity resources are our actual activity resource requirements, just like we had activity lists when we did our network diagram. Now we have activity resource requirements, the types and quantities that we need for each of the activities now that we put into our plan. Each resource, each activity, and then each work package. Again, we're talking about activities, and they roll up into, they relate to the WBS that rolls up into work packages that aggregates a certain set of activities into a logical work package where you aggregate cost and time and so on, and then they roll up into control accounts. So the same thing with resources, because they're part of the WPS work breakdowns. Now here we have, I mentioned the other day, PMI is big on, abbreviations like RBS. I mean, they're common, in the project management industry. But PMI in particular, likes to play games with your mind with abbreviations on their test. So again, what I mentioned is, remember, you have role breakdown structure, you have resource breakdown structure, and other things. So just if you see RBS alone, you just need to figure out what they're talking about within the context of the question. So don't get thrown, just don't assume it's one thing, read it, make sure you understand what it is. In this case, it's the resource breakdown structure. Now we can do that. We can prepare a hierarchical representation by category, type, however you want to do it for your labor, material, equipment, and supplies. And we'll see a little picture of that in a bit. Project documents that are appropriate to update, and we may need to adjust our activity list a bit because of the resources we're able or not able to get. So that may combine or do something, or it may move around activities. You may have to resequence something. If you can move something here and move it later and still keep the integrity of the flow of your work, and move it later because some resource isn't available till then. If you can keep other things moving until then that's the kind of thing you could do. But the point there is then you need to update your activity list because you've moved stuff around. And again, resource calendars may be adjusted appropriately also. And here is a shot, as I said, of a typical resource breakdown structure. Up here you have it's just called project resources. And here's materials, building materials, promotion materials. We don't really care what that is, but here's materials, what they break them down here. People, finally, equipment over here. We can look through materials here. Here's engineering, fit out, whatever that is. But you get down to mechanical items, piping system, finally. We're talking material, and then real specific stuff, glasses, pipe work, valves, pipe support, and then under those, you may even have broken down further. And similar with people, by function or skill. Has a good visual, and you can use this also, another RBS abbreviation is risk management. So similar, you can use it to determine what risk factors just from this too. Like down here, are the valves going to be, are they a problem, special valves, risk. Okay, we're going to talk now about durations when we come back. Okay, now that we've assigned our resources to each of our activities, we're going to actually now assign the time required to accomplish those activities by that resource. And we'll see if all of a sudden, boom, our beginning and our end will become real. We'll have a real duration to our schedule based on all of our estimates. So that's 6.3. So estimating activity durations is the number of work periods for each activity. Work periods would be defined, the number of work periods, there could be different types that you use for different activities, but they're defined in your time management plan. Example would be how many hours or weeks, and then eventually when you actually do your schedule presentation and when you print it out, say in a Gantt chart finally, you would decide there what's appropriate periods to show so your schedule doesn't, so it's visible in a presentation mode. But as far as it is for just assigning now your time at each item, you need to specify, is this per week? What's 5? Let's take them 5. 5 what? 5 hours, 5 days? There may be some tasks, rarely though, that are like within minutes to do. But mostly it's days, parts of days or a week. And you don't want an activity to go more than a week, actually, or you need to really decompose it down into something unless there's a big waiting period in there. Now the waiting period, if you had to wait for something, would not be part of the actual duration because you're waiting. There's no activity in that. You would use a lead or a lag for those kind of issues, arbitrary impositions of more time or less time. So the duration here is a pure duration, irregardless of whether you have to wait for something or not. So if it takes an hour to do this task, and you got to wait a week for something to come in, it's still an hour task. Okay, so that's what you do here, and it all leads up to developing our schedule finally, the real schedule. So here's our data flow diagram. The typical players, as we should know by now, come in to help us and guide us through this. Our schedule management plan, risk register, of course, now it's activity time. And this is the little example I gave about waiting for something. That's a risk. What if it doesn't happen? Or if we can get it earlier, if we can coerce the supplier to get it earlier, that's an opportunity risk. So you may have two risks, a risk that they won't make it, and then an opportunity risk that we could capitalize on if we can get it earlier. So you need to manage your risk. That's the risk register. The resource calendars, of course, come in again. We did that. We used that in great depth last activity where we assigned the actual people, because we're talking resource calendars. This is pure people here. And the activity lists come in, as we know, and the main output is the activity duration estimates. And they've pumped directly now. Finally, everything funnels now into develop the schedule where we'll be able to baseline it there. So let's look at this. Yeah. Oh, the project scope statement. Thank you, Mr. Arrow. The project scope statement, of course, comes in, and that is our other major reference because it has the WBS in it. So input's a long list, longer than some we've seen. The schedule management plan, all the how-tos and the guidance. We can always go back. We don't want to be doing things different all the time. Do it the same, and if it doesn't work, you change the schedule management plan. Our activity documentation here is the main header, but it covers point 2, 3, and 4 over here in the input list. Actually, it's 6.5.1.2, as we just saw. But anyway, the activity documentation to list the attributes and the resources that we have assigned, along with the skills needed for that resource. The calendars, resource availability, our project scope statement. In particular, though, here it has still in there assumptions and constraints that we need to manage. So those are handy to have now as we're talking about time. We may have to put some arbitrary leads or lags in there to accommodate some assumptions or constraints that are in there. And if it's a real hard constraint, for example, we may put a milestone in there. We need to do something before or after this point. So you need the scope statement to help you determine those things. As we mentioned, the risk register comes in and the resource breakdown structure as we saw. Now we can use that as a visual to help us, again, perhaps more efficiently assign our time. The prevailing organizational environmental factors, the EEFs, we may have, there may be productivity metrics of how productive people can be at certain types of highly skilled tasks, for example. Where the team members are, if it's here or elsewhere, may be a factor, but it's a factor, environmental factor. We don't have any control over where they are, and it may affect durations of how we plan. And the tools we have, again, expert judgment, always use them if you can to help you in this task of assigning activities. Now here, we're going to get into some really interesting stuff here. Analogous estimating, parametric estimating, 3-point estimating. Whoa, what is that? Well, if you don't know what that is, it's going to be pretty interesting, but it will help you. It's a lot like we saw earlier where we were looking at, remember the decision tree where we had, do you want to build a plant or upgrade a plant, and they had numbers. It's going to cost us this much to build, this much to upgrade, and then we expect revenue. Well, those aren't real numbers. We don't know what the actual numbers would be under any of those scenarios, but they're the best guess, the best estimate, and they did that back then, if you remember, by saying, management, whoever got together, the team, and said, well, we'll have it this number, the lowest number. It could be as high as this, but we think the best guess would be so-and-so, something in the middle, the most likely. And you pump that through a formula, and you get your beta and triangular graphs, and then you use intelligence to pick something, and then you actually use a number. It's the same thing here. Now we'll actually see the formulas here. They're very simple, but you need to know how you use them. So here we go. Analogous estimating. The actual historical data of similar work. It's an analogy. It's like that. So you can look at past history, historical database, figure out, and make an estimate. Well, it took this long on that project to do this kind of thing. It's similar here, so we're going to assume it'll take that long here, and you may make some adjustments in your mind for whatever. Parametric. These are algorithms. These are statistical relationships between your historical data and your estimated quantities. Because now you can, in past projects, historically it may cost so much to do this thing, and it takes so long to produce this kind of item or activity, and they did it for quantity of 3. We have 200 of them here, so we're going to just assume is that unit cost and time is 200. So that's parametric estimating, that kind of algorithm deal. And we've seen this before. What type of estimating technique is this? Recall here, I'll mouse it over. We have O for an optimistic estimate of whatever that number might be. Over on the far right, we have pessimistic estimates, and in the middle we have M, which means the most likely, and these are all in opinions of the staff you have who are contributing, the experts who are helping you estimate whatever it may be. These result in these graphs down here after you apply this formula, these two formulas up here. Now we finally see the formulas. So now we're talking, this could be time, we're talking time here, that's why it's got a t in front, a little t. So the time estimate is equal to the optimistic time, or 1 in this instance, plus the most likely time, 2, plus the pessimistic time, which is 3, 3, 4, 5, 6, divided by 3 is 2. So you get a triangular average. We all know, and it gives you a graph like this. Beta tends to give you management perhaps a little more options to choose from because it gives you a curve like this down here. And why? Because it's weighted. It says optimistic, 4 times the most likely. They really weight the most likely. If it is most likely, okay, then it's really most likely. So they give it a weighting of 4 plus your pessimistic, and then they divide it by 6 to get that average. And it gives you, in this case, still gives you 2, but you can see the differences in the numbers here, how it varies depending on, of course, whatever numbers are in here. You know, but whatever it is, you get a graph like this. And of course, you can probably guess, if you don't know already, this is called 3-point estimating, because you have your 3 points: optimistic, most likely, and pessimistic. And we saw how we used this in that little scenario in the decision tree diagram, where, you know, well, how did they know it was $200 million to build a new plant and only $50 million to upgrade a plant? Well, they didn't know that. They made their best guess. They did an optimistic. Well, optimistically, we think it'll, you know, cost, you know, $100 million. Pessimistic, $300 million. But the most likely is $200 million, or it could have been even different numbers. When you apply the formula, then the answer in that case was $200 million, and then you get a curve like this. Yeah, that's what they're going to use, whatever it is. But this is the estimating tools that they used, and we use the same concept here when we estimate durations. Here's a task. Some tasks are easy. Well, we've done that 100 times. That'll take them 4 hours. Okay, then you just put in 4 hours. But if there's controversy over really how long will it take to do a particular activity, you may get the group together. I think it'll take, you know, in this case down here, maybe 6 hours. Just, oh, no. I've seen that. It's going to take you 20 hours if it takes you 1, you know. And then, you know, somebody else will say, well, you know, I think really, yeah, true, but most likely, you know, it won't take quite that long, and it's not that easy, so maybe 18. So that's what they're saying here. You apply the formula, you get a curve, and then you just decide, you know, where along there you want to put your actual estimate, and as a group you get consensus, and now you have your duration. So those are the kind of tools you use and how you use them. 3-point estimating considers uncertainty and risk, most likely optimistic, pessimistic, and it comes up with these 2 distribution formulas and graphs, triangular and beta. And just like we even said just there, you know, group decision making is part of all this kind of stuff. You don't use just one of these. You use a combination of them. They all do them together. You don't even know it sometimes. But the group decision making, if you want to talk specifics, is what we did, a commitment to meet your estimate. Okay. Oh, in fact, here it says, and this is important, you get commitment to meet estimates. The commitment increases because now it's a group. You get group consensus. You always want group consensus, obviously. You don't want somebody outlier who just does not agree. Then you got to get into some negotiating tactics, conflict resolution, all those things that you need to be skilled at. And also, really important here is you need to consider what kind of reserves do you need with your time to compensate for, you know, your risks. So here we have our contingency reserves, and if we're talking critical chain methods, we use buffers, and we'll see that a little later. Tomorrow we'll see this, or not tomorrow, in our next module we'll see this. Contingency reserves and buffers. If it's within the schedule and you have a known unknown, you have a risk that you've identified, okay, and you have a plan against it, and you want to put some money against it, or a time to deal with it, along with money also later. We'll see about that, but here we're talking time. You have schedule uncertainty, so you have a known unknown. You call it a contingency reserve. If it's not within the schedule, unforeseen work, well, that's a management reserve. But you have these reserves, and you deal with them here during your duration. So we say, this is pretty risky, you know, and we have a risk for it. Take 5 hours here, but if we have a problem, we may need another 5 hours to recover, so you put 5 hours worth of time in your reserves. So you build up your reserves to compensate for known risks or even unknown risks if you have management reserves. We're going to talk a little more in detail about the reserves right here so we get a little better understanding when we come back. So our last tool and technique to assist us in estimating our activity durations is a reserves analysis, as we talked about just prior to this. And this slide here, I just wanted to give you an overview of all of the instances of reserve analysis within PMBOK. Here we are up here, circled in blue. We're at Time management, estimate activity duration, 6526 reserves analysis. That's just what we talked about, where we talk about known unknowns, and unknown unknowns as far as risk and putting time aside to compensate for the planned time it may take, the response plans to deal with risk when they occur. Also, though, we do reserves analysis under other contexts also. We do it for cost, as we probably already know. We've talked about that in more than we'd have about time reserves so far, though. So under 7.2, estimating costs, that's where we, similar to what we're doing here now with estimating durations, we also look at cost reserves for when we do our cost estimates for our plan here. As we're determining the budget, we also review, again, the reserve analysis, because we're actually creating now the baseline budget. We want to make sure it's right, so we review it again. And as we control the costs, we again review the reserve analysis. So reserve analysis just aren't put out there and you're done with it. They're always in the limelight. They're always available. You got to keep them fresh, so we review them quite often. And as we talked about, when we talked about risk earlier, we also have reserves for those. And those could be both time and cost, because those are our risk response plans where a risk materializes. We need then to deal with the risk. We have to take time and money to execute the response plan, and that's time and money. So both of those there, and that's reserve analysis there. And these just happen to be all tools and techniques. You remember, like the project management information system, sometimes it's an input to us, and sometimes we use it as a tool under tool and technique. And you can just tell right here, these are all tools and techniques, all these. And how do we know that? Remember the numbering scheme? 7.2, that's now the activity 7.2, and point 2 is always a tool and technique. I don't know why PMI didn't put point 2 up here in front of tools and point 1 in front of inputs. That would make it more obvious, but they didn't. But we know just by looking at all these that the third integer, point 2, means these are all tools and techniques. Good. Okay. So estimate activity durations, expert judgment. We have 3 different types of estimating concepts we could use. Analogous, well, it was like that. We'll just use that kind of time frame to do these activities. Parametric. It took 2 hours to do this over there, but it's kind of ramped up on our project, so you assume that it's like 3 times that because of historical information. That's more accurate than analogous many times. And then our 3-point is where you have your optimistic, pessimistic, most likely. You do some formulas and you make a best decision based on that through your group decision making. And then of course reserves analysis accompanies all this relative to your response plans. So the main output is the activity duration estimate list. Quantitative. Leads and lags now are not included, remember. Those are arbitrary restraints, constraints, or constructs that you, as the project manager and the team, will apply. So you can actually delay or advance an activity independent of the time it takes to execute that activity. Remember, 2 hours to do this, but you have to wait a week for something else. You're not going to say it's a week activity. No, it's still 2 hours, but you put a lag in of a week so that when that's over, now you do your 2 hours of work. So that's your lead and lag. And of course, quantitative, I glossed over that. It's a number. It's numeric duration rather than a qualitative duration. This activity will take a long time. Well, that doesn't calculate out very well on a project schedule, so they're quantitative. All right. And you can indicate the ranges too, if necessary. Now, these are not leads or lags. They're actual ranges of what is allowed in this estimate, independent of you got to wait a week for something. Here, 2 weeks plus 2 days or minus 4 days, that's okay inside your activity. Or a 20% probability of exceeding a month, you could use that too. But basically, keep in mind that, remember, leads and lags are just independent of these kind of ranges if that's appropriate for the task at hand. And obviously, by activity. Each one has to have its own time duration, whatever it might be. So we've gone through all of our 10, our 20, our 500 on a very large project, our 2,000 activities, and we've assigned discrete quantitative durations to each one of them. And we've not applied our leads and lags yet, but they're there. They're there for us to use if we need them. So when we come back, we're going to talk now about actually now that we have the activities, we have the resources assigned, and we have the time, we can create now our project schedule. And later on then, we're going to apply cost to it. But that is independent of what it takes to execute the schedule. Okay, so we'll see that when we come back in Module 21.